Hey, this is Robert with Cruzbike, and today we're going to be going over some simple adjustments you can make to your S40, how to do some brake adjustments and some shifting adjustments once you've completed your build. We've got our Cruzbike S40 in the park work stand here. We've extended it up just a little bit so the rear wheel is off the ground just a hair so we can spin it for the brakes. This will give you a good representation of a good way to clamp a cruise bike in a stand. All right, let's get started. All right, here we are with our S40, newly built, newest edition. Everything is pretty good from the factory, but it never hurts to go over your bike and do a nice full adjustment. I'm going to go over the basics of doing some of these adjustments. If you feel uncomfortable adjusting things like brakes, please take your bike to a bike shop for a full tune-up. It's not uncommon on a brand new bike to have things need a little bit of adjustment here and there because these are built in a big factory, so they aren't fully adjusted from the factory. They're pretty close, but we're going to get you close and get you riding out on the road with some smooth shifting and good braking. Okay, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tackle some back brake adjustments. So we have our back brakes here. We're going to listen for a few things. The first thing we're going to listen for is any rubbing of the rotors. If we have rubbing there at the rotors, then we know we need to make an adjustment, especially right out of the box. The other thing we're going to look for is we're going to look for the feel of the lever. We shouldn't be bottoming out here, so we should have a pretty good feel. If this is bottoming out or going way past the lever here, then we need to make an adjustment at the cable. So on these brakes, we have two different things going on. We have the amount of pull at the caliper, and then we have the pad depth. So let's go back to the caliper and take a look at what we have there to adjust. Okay, so here we are at the back caliper. The process for the front caliper is going to be the same. The first thing we need a few tools in order to make this adjustment. So we're going to grab a 5mm Allen. That's going to be used for our cable right here. We're also going to grab a T25. So here's a T25 here. This is the same wrench that's used to do rotors. So you have a T25. The T25 is so we can adjust the calipers here. So we can adjust the side-to-side movement. So hopefully that'll be set pretty good from the factory. We won't have to worry about that. Now the other key adjustment is with a 2mm Allen. So in your cruise bike toolkit you have a 2.5 for the derailleur hanger bolt. The pad adjustments on these particular calipers for this S40 use a 2mm Allen, and that's going to be in here, and it's kind of recessed, so you got to get it in there. Once that's in there, you can see this turns. That turns the pads in and out. So we want to start with the pads all the way out. We don't want to make it too tight. We just want to turn this so the pads are all the way out. Now it's also important to note you don't want to use the ball end. If your Allen wrench has a rounded ball end here, you don't want to use that, because if that gets in there and it gets stuck or it can round out that hole, you always want to use the flat end if possible. So we've adjusted our pads out all the way on each side. We don't have any rubbing currently on the calipers, but I'm not particularly satisfied with the amount of pull I have. So I want to reduce this distance here. So every disc caliper has a specific amount of leverage on this lever arm. Now these brakes are dual piston activated, so each caliper is going to move in together as this cable is pulled. So some older style calipers or some calipers are single side, meaning that when this cable gets pulled right there, only one of the brake pads is moving in. So these are dual-sided, which actually makes our job a lot easier. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to eye this rotor and make sure it's straight. So I'm going to spin this wheel, and once I do that, I can sight right down the edge of the rotor, and I can see if it's moving. So I'm looking for the trueness of the rotor. So if that rotor is spinning nice and straight, then we're really good to go. So here we have a nice straight rotor. It's not wobbling back and forth. If it is wobbling back and forth, they make rotor truing tools that you can bend this rotor back and forth just a little bit in order to straighten that out. That's something I recommend a bike shop do, but that's something that certainly you can do if you have that tool or you have a crescent wrench. Here we have a nice straight rotor, but we're going to loosen these T25s just a little bit. And what that's going to do is that's going to loosen up this caliper so it can adjust side to side, right? So see that? So we have a side to side adjustment here. And now what we're going to do is with these pads adjusted all the way out, we're going to loosen our cable at the pinch bolt with the number 5. See how far that moved? Now since our pads are all the way out, we want this to be really centered. So what we're going to do is we're going to hold this nice and tight. That's going to pinch that rotor and it's going to center this caliper right here. So once we have that done, we can tighten these T25s. So that caliper doesn't move. We're going to spin it and we have a little bit of rubbing. Now if we have that, we're going to loosen just a hair. We want to adjust this to the point where we don't have any rubbing. There we go. I'm going to give these a cinch. You always, of course, want to be careful of your fingers while you're making these adjustments. All right, now that we have that, we can set our depth here at the arm. So I always like to go where it's tight, then I back it off a little bit. I'm going to tighten our cable, give it a spin. Listen for any rubbing at the rotor. Give it a couple squeezes at the grip. That's pretty good. Now the other thing we can do is we can look inside here and we can see where those pads are in relation to the rotor. And once we have that set, then we can use this. If one's too far away, we can adjust that pad in just a little bit so we can get a little bit more braking feel. Okay, so that's an adjustment for the rear brake. The front brake is the same process that you'll use on the rear. It's actually a little easier to do on the front because we can look right down that fork and see those pads. Okay, we have the front brake here. I just want to show you a quick example of when you're looking down the wheel. There we can see the light on the one side of the rotor right there. And we have a little bit on this side. It's a little hard to tell from the video, but what we have here is also our pad adjustment. So if I go in here with this Allen, you can see when I turn this to adjust those pads in, it closes that gap off. So when we make our initial adjustment, we want this to be all the way out. And then same thing on the other side. We want that pad to be all the way out with our number 2 Allen. And here again, you can see if I adjust this in, it closes that gap off because we're moving that pad in. So we want to move that out. See that right there? Give ourselves a nice gap. And then if we sight down here, then we can make sure we have a gap on either side before we tighten down that caliper against the fork. Okay, so we've done a brake adjustment. Those are feeling pretty good at this point. Now again, if you're not comfortable adjusting brakes, I highly recommend you take your cruise bike to a reputable bike shop. This is all normal stuff, so any regular bike shop should be able to adjust your brakes for you. Either check your cable tension, check your pad depth, check the centering of your calipers on the mounts. Those are your main adjustments, and it's much easier to make small adjustments. Give it a feel until you get to where you want to be. Okay, so now that we've tackled that, let's do a quick shifting adjustment. This bike is set up right from the factory with no adjustments. It's pretty good, but let's make a little fine tuning if you need to. On this version has the newer Microshift XLE shifters. Really nice shifters. So we have two different shift methods here. We have the lower paddle, which takes it to a lower gear, or a bigger cog, that is. Then we have the small upper button that moves the derailleur back to a smaller cog, to a higher gear. So we have downshifting with the lower paddle and upshifting with the button here. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're going to run our bike through the gears. So we're going to go up. I'm going to go up to the largest cog. That's pretty good. Don't have a lot of noise. Now we're going to downshift. Now when you do the shifts, it's good. You got to really go for it. You got to push that button. Like, don't kind of gingerly, slowly push it. Just push it, give it a click. Now see right there, hear that? That's a little bit of a concern. So we're going to go all the way down to the smallest cog. Now we're looking at a couple things. We're looking at the angle of the chain as it exits the cassette. Okay, so now we put our derailleur in the smallest cog, or the highest gear, and we're looking at the angle of the cassette here. We're looking at this B limit screw, which is this screw that comes out of the back of the derailleur. And we can see it right there. This is the B limit screw. So this controls the angle of the chain as it exits the cassette. So I'm going to show you an adjustment there. The angle on this one, I have adjusted it so it's a little extreme, but we're going to fix that right now. So this particular derailleur uses a 3mm Allen right there. Now, watch the angle of the chain here. So as I turn this, see that? The angle of the chain is changing in relation to where it exits the cog, right here. So the more I turn this in, the further it pushes the derailleur down. The more I go like this, the more chain wrap it has on the cassette. Now, at some point, if it's wrapped too far around the cassette, it will not shift very well. Same thing the other direction. If you keep turning it this way, at some point it's not going to shift very well because it's not going to catch the teeth of the cassette, and it's not going to hit the little angles and the special little machined ramps that are on each gear. So this angle is critical. So from the factory it looked pretty good, but I'm going to adjust it in just a little bit because we're trying to make sure when this derailleur pushes that chain over, it's catching the gears correctly, creating nice smooth shifts. So again, we're only going to make one adjustment at a time. So the end limit screws have been checked. That's how far this derailleur can move this way and that way. Those screws are here and here because we don't want the derailleur shifting over into the spokes or off into the fork. So that's been checked from the factory and it's pretty good. But we're just going to adjust this B limit screw now. So we've made a little adjustment. So let's do some shifts. We're going to go up a gear, up another gear. The chain is just starting to catch the teeth of this cog here. So in that case, what we want to do is we want to make a adjustment here. So that's what this is for. This is your little fine-tune adjustment. So we're going to turn this either clockwise or counterclockwise. That's going to fine-tune the position of that derailleur. So let's put this back here. We've made a couple turns of that screw. Now we have eliminated our noise there. We can continue up the cassette. Now the real test of the B-limit screw is going to come when we get to these larger cogs. So when we get to these larger cogs, we see that we need a little bit more angle of the chain, otherwise this is going to hit. So if I adjust this in, it's going to get to the point where if this is too far in, you can see this is never going to work. It's going to shift right into that thing, and then your cogs are going to be touching. So if this B-limit screw is too far adjusted out, we have too much chain wrap. And once we have too much chain wrap, see that? Hear it? It's going to make that shift very difficult. It doesn't want to stay in there because the gear itself is actually pushing the derailleur further away than it's actually traveling. So what we're going to have to do there is we're going to have to adjust that B-limit screw out like we had it before, so we have a little bit more room here for some nice clean shifts. Now the other thing is, if we're in that largest cog and we want to get out of that largest cog into the next smaller one, so we're going from the 42 to the 40, if our B-limit screw is not correct, we go to downshift, and that chain doesn't want to come out. See right there, the chain is not quite, it's too wrapped around this gear in order to hop off of it and get into the next one. So in that case, we need to back off our B-limit screw a little more, which will allow that chain to finally come out. Of that gear. So we're going to go back in, we're going to go back out, okay. Now once we have our proper B-limit screw, and then we're in that largest cog, then when we give that shifter a nice press, we dump right out of it into the next gears. There we go. All the way down to the small. Back up. One at a time, all the way to the largest cog. Now again, just like brakes, indexed shifting can be finicky. So you have to play with it. Cables do stretch over time, so you have to make adjustments there. As usual, I highly recommend taking your bike to a good bike mechanic to do any fine tuning if you're uncomfortable. As with the brakes, it's always good to make one adjustment at a time, whether you're adjusting the B-limit screw down here, or you're adjusting the limit screws, or when you're adjusting the cable tension up at the shifter and the brake lever. I always recommend only making small adjustments at a time. The biggest mistake people make is turning a bunch of screws, especially ones they don't need to, like the limit screws, which you should only be checking if your cable is completely detached. The limit screws are set from the factory, so that shouldn't be a problem. All right, so that is some small adjustments for your brakes and your shifters for your Cruzbike S40. That should be what you need to know for those adjustments there. Let's go over a few other quick tips for you when you're riding or when you're making adjustments on your cruise bike. Number one, as always, as mentioned in the assembly video, make sure you have even gaps for the handlebar clamps and also even gaps at the chainstay clamps. Do not over tighten these, they will break. Even gaps, 1/4 turn past snug is all you need. 2 washers on the outside of the pivot clamp bolt and 1 on the other side, on the outside of this clamp. That will allow proper clamping of the tube. Sometimes people put the washer on the inside and then they have creaking or noise or slippage here at the slider, and that's usually why is because the washers are in the wrong position there. Headset tension is set from the factory, so I don't recommend messing with that, but as that's just standard stuff through the top cap here and loosening up these 2 bolts on the pivot clamp. Another common thing that happens is the boom clamp here. Some people will tighten this and it will be back further than the edge of the tube. So, and then it won't properly clamp the boom into the slider. So it's very important that this boom clamp lies right flush with the edge of the slider tube, with the clamp at the bottom so it's lined up with the slot. That will allow proper clamping force against the boom. So sometimes people will have creaking noises here, and that's sometimes why, is because this clamp is pushed too far back and it's not really getting enough clamping force onto the boom. Through axles, always make sure before you go through a daily ride or any kind of serious downhill to check the torque on your through axles. We have the tool, of course, right there stored in the axle, and it can go in the front axle as well for storage. But the through axles can come loose after some rides. This is not uncommon, but you always want to make sure you just check and make sure your through axle is tight, the same way you would check to make sure your quick release axle is tight on your older wheels, on older bikes. If the through axle becomes loose, it can come out. You can also end up with shifting problems because the through axle is what's really holding this front end together. So the through axle is really critical to the shifting. If your through axle is loose, it means that your derailleur and your derailleur hanger might not be lining up with that cassette, and that could be causing shifting problems as well. So you always want to make sure that that is nice and secure before you ride. It'll also affect your braking performance if that through axle is not tight when you ride and before you make adjustments to your brakes. And other than that, please see our other fit videos, and as always, feel free to contact us at support@cruzbike.com if you have any questions, and happy riding.